At the peak period, Michael Essien was not only an excellent midfielder, but also a symbol of strength, endurance, and the never-back-down spirit of modern football, a person who engraved his name in history when becoming the heart of the midfield for Chelsea FC during the most brilliantly successful phase of this team. He contributed to bringing major titles like the Premier League, FA Cup, UEFA Champions League, and Europa League, not only with technique but with the ability to cover the entire field. Precise tackles, powerful forward runs, and iconic long-range goals, especially the volley against Arsenal, once considered one of the most beautiful goals in Premier League history. Before that, at Olympique Lyonnais, he won multiple consecutive Ligue 1 titles, affirming himself as one of the most complete midfielders in Europe. And at the international level, he was a pillar of the Ghana national team in historic World Cup campaigns, contributing to making Ghana the pride of all Africa. All of that not only brought titles but also built the image of a tireless warrior, a person that any coach was ready to place full trust in. Because every time Essien stepped onto the field, he not only played football but fought as if it was the last match of his life. But behind the trophies, the applause and the bright stadium lights was a harsh reality that few saw, where every run, every collision silently eroded his body day by day, and when knee injuries began to appear, then recurred, then became more serious, Essien did not stop, but continued to return to the pitch, continued to fight even when his body had sent clear warning signals, because for him, stopping meant losing everything he had built. The long, painful recovery nights, the returns where he had not yet regained form before having to leave the field again due to injury, the moments standing outside the sideline watching the match unfold without being able to participate, all created a pain, not only physical, but also mental, when a person who was once the center of everything gradually became an observer. And even so, he still continued, still tried, still did not allow himself to give up, because deep inside, Essien was not only a player, but a person accustomed to fighting to the end, even if that meant sacrificing his own body and part of his life. If Michael Essien's story makes you reflect, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the challenging journeys where we will dive deeper into the years that shaped the man. Thank you for following, and please continue with us to explore the journey behind a warrior who never stopped fighting. Michael Essien's childhood was not defined by big dreams or brilliant starts, but by long days in Accra, where poverty was present in every small corner of life, where every morning waking up was not to pursue passion, but to face a reality that did not allow mistakes. In his family, there were not many choices, no backup paths, and no room for failure, because just one slip could make everything collapse immediately. And precisely because of that, from when he was very young, Essien already understood that he was not only living for himself, but also carrying on his shoulders the expectations of his loved ones, those who believed he could become the only way out of that cramped life. The dirt roads, the uneven football fields, the old balls became his world. But that was not a world of pure joy, but a place where he learned to fight, where every shot, every challenge carried a meaning much greater than an ordinary match. While other children played football for entertainment, Essien played football with a fear always present, the fear that if he was not good enough, not strong enough, not fast enough, then everything would stop right there, and then he would return to the exact place he was always trying to escape. Without good football boots, without proper training, without anyone standing behind to guarantee everything would be okay, what he had was only a body that grew tougher through every collision and a will forged in circumstances that did not allow weakness. And this very deprivation created a very different Essien, an Essien who did not fear contact, did not fear pain, because if he stopped to feel the pain, he might not be able to stand up again. The afternoons that stretched until dark, the ball games without referees, without clear rules, where strength and will decided everything, taught him how to survive in a harsh environment. but at the same time also taught him a thing that later would become a double-edged sword, that he must always run more than others, must always try harder than others, and must never be allowed to stop before everything ended. Pressure from family was not direct urging, but a silence full of expectation, eyes following his every step, the belief that he could do what no one else in the family had ever done. And this very expectation made every failure, no matter how small, become much heavier, because it was not only an individual failure, but the failure of a hope. There were days when his body was exhausted, pains that had not yet healed continued to pile on old wounds, but Essien had no choice to stop, because in his mind stopping was not resting but accepting failure, and that was more terrifying than any pain his body could endure. It was precisely in those years that football gradually lost the image of a game and became the only path, a path so narrow it did not allow turning back, where every step had to be accurate, every decision had to be right, and every mistake could have to be paid for with the entire future. People later would see a strong Essien, tireless, a player who could run throughout the match without slowing down. But very few understood that all of that did not come naturally, but was built from a childhood that did not allow him to be weak, from the days when he had to learn to push past his own limits before his body was truly ready, and from a fear always present that if he did not continue moving forward, he would be left behind forever. This very fear pushed him farther, faster, stronger, but it also made him never learn how to stop at the right time, never allow himself to rest when necessary, and never listen to warning signals from his body, because in the mind of the boy back then, stopping meant losing everything, and that was something he could not accept, no matter how great the price to pay. When Michael Essien left Ghana to go to Europe, it was not a trip carrying the excitement of a dream just beginning, but like a separation from everything familiar, a step he knew he could not turn back from, because behind there was nothing left to return to, and ahead was a completely foreign world. That decision came quickly, but its price lasted very long, because in the moment he set foot on French soil, everything that had once defined who he was seemed to disappear, from language, culture, communication to the simplest things like the feeling of belonging somewhere, all became distant. At SC Bastia, where it was expected to be the starting step for the new journey, Essien did not step in with the status of a welcomed talent, but like a person who had to prove himself again from the beginning. A name that no one really knew, a young player who had to compete in a harsh environment where no one cared where he came from or what he had been through. The only thing important was whether he could stay or not. The first days had no halo, no recognition, only long training sessions, suspicious looks, and an invisible gap between him and those around him that he did not know how to cross, because even communication became a challenge. When familiar words no longer worked, and every sentence in a foreign language became clumsy, lacking confidence, as if he was trapped in his own thoughts and could not escape. Culture shock was not only in the external differences, but also in the feeling that he did not belong here, when everything happening around had a rhythm he had never been used to, when teammates could laugh and chat naturally, while he could only silently observe, trying to understand without really integrating, and this very silence gradually became a protective shell, a way for him to exist without having to face the feeling of separation directly. There were evenings when, returning after training, there was no one to talk to, no laughter, no sharing, only prolonged quiet and thoughts that kept returning, wondering if this decision was right, whether everything he had left behind was worth trading for this feeling of being lost, and that if he failed here, he would not only lose the opportunity, but also lose the very place he once called home. But even in those moments, Essien did not allow himself to stop, because he understood that going back was not an option. And if he wanted to survive, he had to adapt, had to change, had to learn to turn loneliness into motivation, turn silence into strength, and turn every difficulty into part of the growth process. On the training field, he began to speak less and do more, letting his body speak instead of words, letting the challenges, runs, tackles become the only way for him to be recognized. And gradually, even without many words, he began to make others notice, not because he tried to fit in, but because he never stopped making efforts to prove his value. Essien's adaptation did not come from changing who he was, but from accepting the circumstances and finding a way to exist in them, learning every word in the new language, understanding every rule in the new environment, and step by step rebuilding the feeling of belonging that he had lost when leaving Ghana. But the price of that maturity was prolonged isolation, emotions kept inside, the habit of shouldering everything alone without sharing with anyone, and this very thing, while helping him become stronger on the pitch, quietly created a gap within him, a gap that later, even when he had succeeded, he still could not completely overcome. When looking back at the time at Bastia, people might see it as the starting step of a great career. But for Essien, it was also the period when he had to trade a lot to survive, had to learn to live in a world that did not wait for him, had to accept that to move forward. Sometimes one had to leave behind everything familiar and had to understand that there were journeys that not only took away places, but also took away the feeling of belonging, forcing a person to create a new version of themselves, stronger, tougher, but also much more lonely. Leaving the quiet days at SC Bastia, Michael Essien stepped into a new period at Olympique Lyonnais, where it was no longer a story just to survive, but a place where he was forced to rise, and it was precisely here that everything he had endured before began to transform into the strength that made all of Europe pay attention. No longer the lost boy trying to find a foothold, Essien now became a midfielder who could do everything on the field, a person who not only ran more but ran smarter, challenged stronger, and most importantly, never backed down before any opponent, even the biggest names in French or European football. The training sessions at Lyon were no longer challenges to adapt, but a place where he continuously pushed his body past limits, where every day was a battle to become better, stronger, faster, and in that process, he gradually built a clear identity, a midfielder who not only played football, but imposed the match with his physicality and will. He was not the most technical on the field, nor the most creative, but he was the person any team needed because he brought balance, stability, and a source of energy that seemed never to run out. On the field, Essien did not avoid contact. On the contrary, he sought it as a natural part of the match, as if every challenge was an opportunity to affirm himself, and this very playing style made him a nightmare for opponents, a player whose mere presence in midfield was enough to change the course of the match. Precise tackles, bursts of speed from his own half up to the opponent's penalty area, situations recovering the ball in important moments, all created the image of a true machine, a person who seemed not to know fatigue. Success came to Lyon not as a surprise when the team consecutively dominated League One, but what made Essien special was the way he contributed to that success. Not through flashy moments, but through continuous presence, through always being in the right position, doing the right tasks, and being willing to do more than what was asked. Gradually, he was not only recognized in France, but also monitored by big clubs across Europe, evaluated as one of the most complete midfielders of his generation, a player who could adapt to any system and bring immediate value. But along with that recognition, something else also quietly appeared, the first signs of wear that not everyone noticed, not even himself. His body began to endure more than normal, small pains appeared more frequently, training sessions ended with prolonged fatigue longer than before. And even though he could still play at the highest level, could still run throughout the match without slowing rhythm, inside, the pressures accumulating day by day began to leave traces. Essien was not a person who would stop to listen to his body, because from when he was young, he had learned to ignore weak signals, had gotten used to enduring and continuing, so when the first signs appeared, he did not see it as a problem but only as part of the job, a small price to pay to maintain form. But this very way of thinking made him continue pushing himself further, continue playing at high intensity without enough time to recover, continue choosing to fight instead of resting. And little by little, his body began to accumulate injuries that later would become irreversible. Those around him could see a stronger, more complete Essien, a player stepping into the peak of his career. But few realized that it was precisely in this period, when everything seemed to be going in the right direction, that the seeds of collapse had been sown, not loudly, not clearly, but deep enough that one day they would reveal themselves as major events. And as Essien continued to advance, continued to be praised, continued to become the target of top European teams, he had no idea that the path he was walking, the path built from strength and sacrifice, was also the path that would force him to pay a price that no title could compensate. When Michael Essien left Olympique Lyonnais to join Chelsea FC, it was not only a big contract but also the turning point that shaped his entire career, because under Jose Mourinho, Essien was no longer simply a talented midfielder but became an indispensable part in the operating structure of the whole team, a person required to do everything, to appear in every position, to take on every role the match demanded. Mourinho did not see Essien as a player with limits, but as a solution for every problem. And this very trust was both an honor and a pressure that he carried with every time he stepped onto the field. In the Chelsea lineup, Essien was not fixed in one position. He could play defensive midfielder, central midfielder, even drop back to play as a fullback when necessary. And wherever he was, he played with the same intensity, the same uncompromising spirit, as if his body had no stopping point. Each match that passed, he ran a few more kilometers, challenged a few more times, threw himself into plays that many others would choose to avoid. And gradually, that became the standard, not only for the fans but for himself, that Essien must always be the one who did the most, endured the most, and was never allowed to reduce any part in that dedication. The workload at Chelsea was unlike anywhere he had experienced before. The dense match schedule, high intensity, pressure from the Premier League, Champions League, and cup competitions made every week feel like an endless marathon. And in that chain of days, Essien almost had no time to rest properly. His body moved from playing state to recovery, then immediately back to playing. A continuous loop without real breaks. But instead of complaining, he accepted it as an inevitable part, because in his mind, being on the field meant he still had value, and as long as he had value, he must continue to contribute. Beside him were talented teammates, including Didier Drogba, who not only shared battlefield moments with him, but also deeply understood the pressure of an African player competing at the peak of Europe. Between them, there was no need for too many words, because every time they stepped onto the field, they both knew what they had to do, how to fight to maintain the team's and their own position. In big matches, when everything became tense, Essien and Drogba were like two pillars keeping the team from collapsing. One up front, one deeper, but sharing the same spirit that never backed down. Chelsea's dependence on Essien gradually became clearer through each season. When he was not only a supporter but the foundation for how the team operated, when he was absent, a gap immediately appeared. When he was present, everything became more solid, more stable, and this very thing made him a name almost indispensable in the starting lineup, no matter who the opponent was, no matter the circumstances. But along with that trust was an unspoken requirement that he must always be ready, always healthy, always in the best state, something that in reality no human body could maintain forever. In those years, Essien was not only playing football, he was gradually consuming himself. Every run, every collision, every tackle took away a small part of his body that no one could see immediately. And because he always played with everything he had, without holding back, without calculating, the wear happened faster, deeper than what the surface showed. There were matches where he finished in complete exhaustion, but just a few days later, he appeared on the field with the same energy, the same determination. as if there had never been any sign of fatigue. People praised Essien for his endurance, for his unlimited fighting spirit, for his work rate that few players could match, but few asked whether a person could maintain that for how long, and whether behind those energetic performances his body was enduring what. Essien was not a person who would ask that question of himself, because from when he was young, he had gotten used to running until he could not run anymore, used to fighting until there was nothing left to give. And this very habit, in the harsh environment like Chelsea, was not only maintained but pushed to a higher level, where each passing day he moved closer to his own limits without realizing it. When looking back at this period, people would see an Essien at the peak of form, a perfect player for Mourinho's system, a tireless warrior, but deep inside, this was also the time when his body began to accumulate the greatest injuries. Injuries that later could not be fully recovered, and when everything was still at the peak, when cheers still rang out every time he touched the ball, no one, not even Essien, could imagine that the very years considered the most brilliant were the time when the real price of his career was gradually being formed, quietly, slowly, but unavoidably. In the peak years at Chelsea FC, Michael Essien was not simply a player in the starting lineup, but the operating foundation of the entire system. The person through whom every ball, every transition, every defensive or counterattack situation more or less passed. Under Jose Mourinho, Essien was not used as a fixed link, but as a comprehensive solution for every situation. A player who could appear anywhere on the field, from midfield, right flank, wing-back, to dropping deep like a center-back when the team needed absolute safety. This very versatility turned him into one of the most important factors in Chelsea's successful era, where every big match carried his mark, even if he did not always appear on the scoreboard. Matches in the Premier League, Champions League, or tense clashes against big opponents all showed the same image. Essien running non-stop, challenging non-stop, and appearing at every hotspot as if he was in two places at once. Decisive tackles, situations cutting seemingly sure passes that would create opportunities for opponents, and bursts of speed from his own half to support attack had become familiar images, making him seen as the engine of the team. There were matches that people remembered for someone else's goal, but those who truly understood Chelsea remembered how Essien extinguished dangerous counterattacks, remembered how he rushed back to cover when the defense was stretched, and remembered how he maintained the match rhythm with his own energy. He not only played football, he controlled space, controlled intensity, and sometimes controlled the emotions of the match with his irreplaceable presence. His role in the system was not a choice but a necessity, because when Essien was present, the team became more solid, more balanced, and when he was absent, the gap immediately showed like a structure missing its foundation. That was why he was always used in the most important matches, regardless of his physical condition. But this very dedication, without holding anything back, shaped his silent tragedy. Essien did not know how to play football half-heartedly, did not know how to slow down to protect himself, because in his mindset, every match was a unique opportunity, and if he did not give everything, he felt like he was betraying the very path that had brought him here. He ran as if there was no tomorrow, challenged as if it was the last play, and always put his body into situations that most other players would avoid, because he believed that only in that way was he worthy of his position in the lineup. But the human body, no matter how strong, also has limits, and in those years, those limits began to show slowly but unavoidably. Small pains in the knee, muscle strains lasting longer than normal, training sessions where he needed more time to recover, all appeared as warning signals that he frequently ignored. He still played, still ran, still threw himself into every play as before, but inside, the wear was happening day by day, match by match, season by season. The scariest thing was not a single injury that stopped everything but hundreds of small cracks accumulating over time, quietly weakening the foundation of a body once considered unbreakable. The big matches he once dominated began to feel heavier. Bursts of speed were no longer as easy as before, and sometimes, in just a few fleeting moments, people could see a very slight, slowing, almost negligible, but carrying the meaning of an irreversible change. However, Essien still continued, because he did not know any other way to exist in the world of top football other than continuing to contribute, continuing to sacrifice, continuing to put the team above himself. And this very choice, repeated through every match, every season, turned him into a symbol of absolute dedication, but at the same time also the person quietly moving closer to the final limit of his body without knowing it. After the seasons where Michael Essien almost became a symbol of strength and endurance in the Chelsea FC shirt, the first moment everything changed came without noise, without warning, but strong enough to derail an entire career that was at its peak. It was not a dramatic accident in a big match, but in seemingly ordinary play, a familiar movement his body had performed thousands of times, but this time it ended with a different feeling, a pain unlike anything he had experienced before, deeper, heavier, and more worrying. The first serious knee injury came to Essien like a sudden interruption in the rhythm of life he thought he could maintain forever. And right at the moment, the doctor gave the diagnosis. Not only his body was damaged, but also the feeling of control he had always trusted began to shake. For the first time in his career, he could not decide for himself whether he could run or not, could play or not, could continue being himself on the field or not. The treatment process dragged on, repeated physical therapy days, painful recovery sessions, and the patience he was forced to relearn from the beginning, all became part of a new life he had never prepared for. Instead of high-intensity training sessions, now there were slow movements. Instead of the feeling of bursting forward on the pitch, there was heaviness in every step. And instead of the freedom of a top player, there was dependence on every reaction of his body. During that time, the scariest thing was not only the physical pain but the feeling of losing control. When an athlete who once believed he could conquer every limit suddenly had to face the reality that his body no longer listened to his will. Each time, trying to return, he again faced a question that had never existed before: whether he was still himself anymore. The days not allowed on the field stretched into weeks, then months, and during that time, football was no longer part of life, but became something distant, only observable from the outside. He watched teammates play, watched the team continue to advance, and in his heart, a strange feeling began to appear, not jealousy, but a quiet worry that the world had continued operating without needing him. When returning to training, Essien was no longer the tireless machine as before, but a version that had to calculate every run, every collision, every turn. His body no longer reacted naturally, but always had a certain delay, as if between thought and action a gap had appeared that had never existed before. This not only affected his personal form, but also directly impacted his position in the lineup when other players began to take over roles that previously, almost by default, belonged to him. And competition was no longer based on ability, but on who could maintain a more stable condition. For Essien, this was a shock not easy to accept, because he was not used to being limited by his own body, not used to sitting out big matches, and even less used to the feeling of gradually becoming an alternative choice instead of a mandatory choice in the starting lineup. Pressure came not only from outside but also from inside him, where there always existed a voice urging him to return, to prove that everything had not ended, but each time trying to push his body past limits, he received clearer signals that the previous wholeness was no longer there. The injuries not only interrupted his career, but also changed the way he viewed himself. When from a player who always believed he was invincible, he began to learn to accept the fragility of the body, a truth no one in the world of top football wanted to face. And in that transition, the scariest thing was not being replaced, but realizing that time did not stand still, that football did not wait for anyone to recover, and that with just one unlucky moment, everything built over many years could begin to slip out of reach slowly but irreversibly. After a long period of treatment for the first serious injury, Michael Essien stood before a choice that in theory should have been very clear, but in reality was full of contradictions. Either continue waiting until his body fully recovered, or return to the pitch when not truly ready because both the team and his career needed him. And in the harsh environment of top football at Chelsea FC, waiting was never a privilege. Pressure did not come directly, but it was present in everything around him. The dense match schedule, important matches in the Premier League and Champions League, expectations from the coaching staff, and the invisible responsibility of a player who was once an irreplaceable pillar under Jose Mourinho, all created a weight that made the decision to rest much harder than the decision to return. No one said directly to him that he had to play, but no one could give him more time either, and in that gap, Essien understood that a career never stood still, waiting for a body to fully recover. When he returned to the pitch, it was not the image of a player who was truly ready, but a person trying to reintegrate with the speed and intensity that he himself had once defined. The first runs carried clear caution, collisions no longer happened as naturally as before, and in every movement there was always a small part of hesitation, as if his body was protecting itself from the risk of recurrence. But top football had no room for slowing down, and after just a few matches, Essien was forced back into the old rhythm because the team needed him, and he also needed to prove that he could still contribute. The matches after returning no longer carried the same sense of wholeness as before, even though he still appeared on the field, still joined challenges, still ran and fought, but there was a subtle change in how his body responded, a small delay but enough to make everything different. He was no longer the one always present at every hotspot, like before, but sometimes had to adjust his position, conserve energy, and choose plays instead of throwing himself into everything. Pressure from the Ghana national team also did not ease, because Essien was not only a club player but also a symbol of an entire generation of Ghanaian football, the person the whole nation placed expectations on in major tournaments. And that very thing made resting almost non-existent in his choices. He returned to the lineup, participated in important matches, but his body began to react differently, no longer with the absolute stability he once had. Small pains returned, at first just fleeting, but gradually became clearer and more persistent, like reminders that the injury had never truly disappeared. The most dangerous thing was not the first injury, but returning too soon. And Essien began to feel that in the clearest way when the injury recurred, not as a sudden shock, but as the return of a problem that had only been temporarily covered. Each time he fell to the ground, the feeling was no longer the same, not only physical pain, but also heaviness in his mind, as he understood that his body was sending signals he could no longer ignore. But even then, he still stood up, still tried to continue, because in the world of top football, stopping was not only a personal issue, but also affected the collective. And Essien had never been a person who put himself above the team. The internal conflict between will and physical condition began to become central in every decision he made. The will wanted to keep fighting, wanted to hold his position, wanted to prove that injury could not define his career, but his body kept presenting new limits he could not overcome as before. In training sessions, he had to adjust intensity. In matches, he had to calculate every movement, and in important moments, he could no longer react on instinct as before. That did not happen immediately but gradually, little by little, until the difference became undeniable. And while the outside world still saw an Essien fighting, still taking the field, still playing at a high level, inside him was a different battle. The battle between a person who did not want to stop and a body forcing him to accept his own limits. This very internal conflict, prolonged through every match and every season, marked the most important turning point in his career, from a player always in a state of wholeness to a player who had to learn to live with limits, even though he had never truly wanted that to happen. After the hasty and risky return, Michael Essien no longer entered each season with the same sense of wholeness as before, but instead a series of days living between hope and fear, when every time he stepped onto the field carried a question no one wanted to answer. How would his body react this time? And at Chelsea FC, where playing intensity was always at its highest and there was no room for instability, Essien began to enter a loop that later shaped the rest of his career, a loop of returning, injury, recovery, then returning again, but each time the price paid was greater than before. The injuries were no longer isolated events but became a continuous, prolonged, repeating chain that grew harder to control. Knees, hamstrings, thigh muscles, all began to speak in ways he had never experienced before, no longer temporary pains that could be ignored but real limits, forcing him to stop, forcing him to leave the field, forcing him to watch teammates play from outside the sideline in an increasingly familiar helplessness. Each time he missed matches, the time was no longer short as before, but stretched into many weeks, many months, and each return, the gap between him and the rhythm of top football grew a little larger. He could no longer maintain explosiveness throughout 90 minutes, could no longer press continuously as before, and even familiar bursts of speed began to require more calculation than instinct. The decline in physical condition did not come suddenly, but accumulated quietly. Like an invisible reverse current always present, his speed, once one of his most fearsome weapons, began to decrease over time, not disappearing completely, but no longer enough to make a difference in decisive moments. Meanwhile, football did not wait for anyone, and younger, faster, fitter players began to appear, taking positions that previously, almost by default, belonged to him. At Chelsea, where competition was always fierce, missing a few matches was no longer simply a physical issue, but became a positional issue. And Essien, from an irreplaceable player, began to feel for the first time in his career that he could be replaced. Each time he returned after injury, he carried the hope that this time everything would be different, that his body had recovered enough for him to return to his rightful place. But reality was always harsher than expectation. He still played, still contributed, but no longer in the dominant state as before, and that was enough to change the coaching staff's view, enough to change his role in the lineup. No longer the absolute center of midfield, Essien began to be used more flexibly, sometimes in deeper positions, sometimes rotated, sometimes left on the bench in big matches, and each such change, even small, was a clear sign that his position was no longer fixed as before. The hardest thing was not the injuries, but watching his own body no longer meet the standards he had once set. There were matches he entered with great determination, but after just a few challenges, his body could no longer maintain the necessary intensity, forcing him to adjust, to play safer, to choose more than natural reflex. That change not only affected performance, but also psychology. When a player who once believed he could control everything began to realize he could no longer control himself as before. In the locker room, Essien was not someone who talked much about his difficulties. He continued to stay silent, continued training, continued trying to return. But that silence did not make the problem disappear, only made it clearer over time. New teammates arrived, new tactical systems, new demands from coaches, all requiring stability that he could no longer guarantee continuously, and gradually his role in the team began to shrink. Essien's spirit did not collapse immediately, because he was the type of player built from endurance, from years that never allowed him to give up. But this very persistence made him continue returning to the pitch more than his body could endure, and each time the price was greater. No one saw that clearly right away, because when he took the field he still fought, still made efforts, still showed the familiar spirit, but inside, the decline process was happening irreversibly. And in that chain of days, Essien not only lost physical condition, speed, or official position, but also began to face a much harder truth, that his career was no longer going straight upward as before, but was entering a phase where every attempt to return came with a greater trade-off, And even though he still continued fighting, still continued trying, top football had begun to operate at a rhythm that his body could no longer fully keep up with. When the recurring injuries and time away from matches grew longer with each season, the football world around Michael Essien began to change at a pace where he was no longer the center. At Chelsea FC, where he was once considered one of the most important pillars, newer faces, younger, faster, less injury-prone, began to appear, bringing the energy of a generation without the heavy past like his. Football always operated by that ruthless rule, where there was no room for slowing down, and when Essien returned after each treatment, he realized his position was no longer taken for granted as before. The gaps he once filled had now been taken by others, and the only thing left was continuous competition to hold on to a part of the role that had once belonged to him. The arrival of the new generation of players was not only a personnel change, but also a change in how value on the pitch was perceived. Speed was prioritized over experience, physical stability placed higher than know-how, and in that context, Essien gradually became a tactical option more than a mandatory foundation in the lineup. He was still used, still trusted in important matches, but no longer the first name written into the starting lineup. Instead, there was rotation, periods on the bench, matches where he only entered when the situation truly needed his experience and solidity. And this very change, even though it happened gradually, created a very clear feeling in his heart. The feeling of no longer being the center of everything. The media, which had once praised Essien as one of the most complete midfielders in Europe, also began to shift. Headlines no longer revolved around him, analyses no longer mentioned him as a decisive factor, and his presence in discussions about top football gradually became rarer. Not because he disappeared completely, but because the world had grown used to new names, new stories, new symbols, and in that flow, Essien became a familiar name, but no longer current. Fans still remembered him, but no longer talked about him with the same frequency. No longer mentioned him as an indispensable part of the present, but more as part of memory. Meanwhile, Essien still continued fighting, still maintained his career with everything his body still allowed. He did not stop, did not withdraw, did not choose the easy path, because inside him there always existed a belief formed very early that stopping meant abandoning the entire journey he had built. He continued training, continued taking the field when given the chance, continued trying to keep himself at the highest competitive level possible, even knowing his physical limits were no longer as before. And this very effort, even though it no longer created explosive moments as in the past, was still proof of a spirit that did not easily accept endings. But the feeling of being left behind did not come from one specific moment, but from the accumulation of many small details. Being mentioned less in tactical analyses, no longer the default choice in big matches, having to accept less prominent roles in the lineup. There were days he watched younger players do what he once did, with higher speed, less risk, and more efficiency, and in those moments the silence inside him became clearer than ever. Not jealousy, but a quiet realization that football had moved into a different phase where he was no longer at the center of development. Even so, Essien never abandoned his efforts. He continued adjusting his playing style, continued adapting to new demands, continued finding ways to contribute in the way most suitable to his current condition. He learned to control the match rhythm instead of dominating it, learned to choose positions more intelligently instead of running more, and learned to become a supporting part instead of the absolute center. But no matter how much he changed, he still understood he was going against the natural flow of a player's career, where time always favored the newer, younger, and less damaged. Deep down, the feeling of being left behind came not only from the pitch, but also from his own self-awareness. From a player once seen as irreplaceable, he gradually became a person who had to adapt to survive, and that change, even though not loud, carried greater weight than any injury. But even in that state, Essien still continued moving forward, because he had never learned to stop, just because the world had changed. And this very thing created a paradox in his journey. The more he was pushed to the edge, the harder he tried to stay, and the harder he tried to stay, the more he realized that time never waited for anyone, even someone who had once been one of the strongest warriors in European football. After years worn down by injuries and the unavoidable change of time, the moment Michael Essien left Chelsea FC did not come as a big shock to the football world, but for him it was an indescribable emptiness, as if a part of the identity that had once defined who he was had been separated from his life. At Chelsea, he was not only a player but part of the system, a symbol of strength and endurance, and when that door closed, what remained was not only a career transition but the feeling of losing a place where he had once completely belonged. The years there had shaped Essien in an irreversible way, and when leaving, he did not just leave a club but left the most stable version of himself. His next destination at Real Madrid carried the expectation of a new chapter, but reality did not reflect the glory people imagined. In a squad full of big stars, where every position had fierce competition and almost no room for experimentation, Essien was no longer placed at the center as before. He was no longer the one shaping match rhythm, but became a supplementary option, a depth choice more than a core factor. His role narrowed, not because he no longer had ability, but because the system no longer revolved around him. And in that change, the familiar feeling of importance gradually disappeared. Then came the period at AC Milan, where Essien continued his journey in a different football environment, slower, more tactical, but also far from the peak he once knew. Here he was no longer the image of a midfielder who could dominate the entire midfield, but became an experienced player used in specific moments. He still took the field, still played, still carried the professional spirit that had become instinct, but his presence no longer carried the same dominance as before. His runs no longer created the same impact. His challenges no longer made opponents wary in the old way, and the difference between a past Essien and a present Essien became clearer through every match. No longer having a central role was harder to accept than any injury he had ever experienced, because it did not come from one specific moment, but from the gradual change in how the world perceived him. From a player teams built around, he became a piece in an already existing structure where everything no longer depended on him. That did not make him stop, but forced him to face a new reality, that his value was no longer measured by absolute influence, but by the ability to adapt to less prominent roles. The biggest difficulty was not playing at new clubs, but finding the feeling of belonging again. At Chelsea, everything had once been so familiar he did not need to think, from how the team operated to his own role in every match. But when he left, all of that disappeared, and he was forced to start over in systems not designed for him. In every match, every training session, every tactical decision, there always existed an invisible gap between the person he once was and the person he was becoming, and that gap could not be filled by experience or effort alone. The disorientation did not come immediately, but formed from the repetition of small details: less ball, less influence, less attention. Things that were once default now became things to fight for, and in that process, Essien began to realize that football had not only changed around him, but had also changed the way he existed in it. He was still a professional player, still a warrior on the field, but the role of that warrior was no longer the same as before. What made this journey heavier was not simply the decline in form, but the feeling of having to constantly redefine himself in a world that no longer saw him in the old way. And even though he still continued playing, still continued contributing, still maintained professionalism to the end, deep inside the journey of finding himself again became a different battle, a battle with no stadium, no audience, and no final whistle. After leaving the big stages of European football, Michael Essien did not stop. Even though his body no longer operated as before, and even though the lights of the peaks at Chelsea FC, Real Madrid, or AC Milan had gradually faded, he still continued on the football path. but this time in smaller, less glamorous environments, where a player's value was no longer measured by titles or media, but by whether he could still take the field or not. The new teams no longer saw him as a dominating midfield symbol, but as a person with experience, a player who had once been at the peak but was now trying to extend his career a little longer. The playing conditions at these clubs were far different from what he had once been used to. There were no longer perfect facilities, no longer star-studded squads, no longer comprehensive support from a system built to win at the highest level. Instead, there were more modest pitches, matches with fewer spectators, and battles more practical than artistic. But even in those circumstances, Essien still took the field with the same professional attitude, as if every match was still a final, even though his body no longer allowed that to happen as fully as before. Training sessions no longer carried explosiveness, but became more about managing the body than developing it. Every run was considered, every collision had to account for consequences, and every time he played came with a silent question whether the body could endure one more time or not. But even though the limits became clearer, Essien still continued, because football for him was not only a career, but the part that had shaped his entire person since he was a boy in Ghana, where he had once learned to run not to win, but to survive. The love for football in him did not disappear over time. It even became clearer in this period, when all the glamorous things no longer covered the core values. He no longer played for fame, no longer played for achievement pressure, but simply because he could not imagine what his life would be like without stepping onto the pitch. This very thing made him continue, even when his body had many times sent clear signals that it was no longer in a state to endure top-level playing intensity. But professional football, no matter the level, was still an environment that demanded precision and stability, and over time, Essien's limits began to become impossible to hide. Speed was no longer as before, space coverage gradually decreased, and the challenges that had once been his greatest strength no longer brought the same effectiveness. He still played, but in a different way, smarter, more economical, less explosive, as if learning to play football with a body that no longer completely belonged to him. There were matches he finished with the clear feeling that he was no longer the strongest version of himself, but he still continued to return, because inside him existed an absolute loyalty to football, a loyalty that did not depend on circumstances or playing level. No matter where, no matter what environment, Essien still carried the same spirit, but the difference lay in the fact that his body could no longer keep up with that spirit as before. The limits did not come as a sudden moment, but like a slow accumulation process, where each passing season added another layer of fatigue, another sign of decline, another small gap between will and real ability. And in that repetition, Essien not only faced the change of football, but also faced the change in himself. When a player once seen as unstoppable now had to learn to accept that there were things his body could no longer do. Even so, he still continued, because for Essien, leaving the pitch was never an easy decision, and each time he stepped onto the field, no matter the level, it was still an affirmation that he was not ready to end his journey. Throughout his entire career, spanning many countries, many clubs, and many ups and downs, Michael Essien always carried something that very few people truly saw: silence. Not the silence of a person with nothing to say, but the silence of a person accustomed to handling everything himself, enduring every pressure himself, and stepping through every event himself without needing attention from the outside world. Even when playing on the biggest stages like Chelsea FC, Real Madrid, or AC Milan, Essien rarely appeared in noisy stories off the pitch, rarely became the focus of controversies, and almost never used words to define himself. Instead, he let his feet do that, let the matches, the challenges, and the moments on the field speak for everything. His reticence was not a media strategy, but part of a nature formed very early, from the days back in Ghana, where he learned not to share too much about fatigue not to complain about circumstances, and not to turn difficulties into stories for others to listen to. Instead, he chose to face them directly, quietly, and alone. When stepping into European football, that habit did not change but became even clearer, because the professional environment did not encourage weakness, and Essien understood very early that in that world silence was sometimes the only way to survive. There were not many notable statements, no media controversies, no personal stories widely exploited. Essien almost always kept himself at the boundary of absolute privacy, even when facing serious injuries or the most difficult periods of his career. When his body began to respond more slowly, when injuries repeated and directly affected his position in the lineup, he did not choose to publicly complain or create attention, but continued stepping into training, continued working with doctors, continued trying to return, without turning the process into an outside story. The difficulties he went through were largely never fully told. The training sessions where he had to leave the field early because of pain, the long, silent recovery nights, the time sitting out watching teammates play while his body did not allow participation, all happened inside a world the public did not see. And this very silence made Essien's journey special, because it was not built on dramatic outside stories, but on prolonged endurance inside. Even in the most difficult periods, when he was no longer at peak form, when his role in the team began to change, when physical limits became clearer, Essien still did not change the way he faced everything. He did not seek sympathy, did not seek explanations, and did not seek attention. He continued working, continued adapting, and continued accepting that football was a journey where each person had to go through most of their difficulties alone. That was why, when looking back at his entire career, what stood out was not words or grand statements, but their absence. A career defined not by what was spoken, but by what was kept inside. In a football world where many players built their image through media, Essien existed in the opposite way, letting silence become his main language, and letting action on the pitch become the only answer for everything he went through. And perhaps that very thing made his pain harder to recognize but also deeper. Because when a person did not talk about their fatigue, the world would not know when they were truly collapsing. And when a person always continued, playing even when their body was no longer at its best, the world would only see the endurance without seeing the price behind it. Essien had lived his entire career that way, quietly, steadfastly, and almost never sharing what was really happening inside him, until everything gradually became an inseparable part of who he was. When time finally forced Michael Essien to face what he had avoided for many years, the decision to leave the pitch did not come as an explosive moment or a loud announcement, but as a prolonged silence, where his body had spoken for everything words could not express. After a series of injuries, after seasons no longer at peak level, and after attempts to return but unable to find the strongest version of himself at Chelsea FC, Real Madrid or AC Milan, Essien understood that football was no longer a place he could exist in the old way. The retirement decision did not bring immediate relief, but a prolonged emptiness, because for a person who had lived his whole life in the rhythm of the pitch, stopping was not simply ending a career, but ending a part of the identity that had shaped who he was for so long. Mornings without training, trips without matches, and nights without physical recovery forced him to face a new reality where football was no longer the center of everything. But instead of disappearing from the sports world, Essien began a new journey, moving into coaching, where he was no longer the person running directly on the field, but the one standing outside, observing, guiding, and sharing experience with the next generation. In the new role, he did not seek attention as before, but accepted a quieter position, where value was no longer measured by minutes played or decisive plays, but by the ability to convey, to understand the match, and to help others develop. This was a big change for a person once used to controlling the match with his own feet. But Essien did not try to become a different person. He only learned to use what remained of himself in a different way, transforming the experience of a top player into knowledge for those who came after. Life after football no longer had the fierce pressures of weekly matches, but carried another quieter form of challenge, when he had to get used to no longer being the center of attention, no longer the one deciding results on the field, and no longer living in the intense rhythm of top football. The early days of this transition were not easy, because his body still carried the memory of hundreds of matches, while reality demanded a completely different slowness and stability. Adaptation did not happen immediately but was a long process, where Essien had to learn to accept that his value no longer lay in playing but in understanding and sharing. He began to see football from a different angle, no longer the absolute insider but an experienced observer, someone who could see things the younger generation had never experienced. That did not make him lose his identity, but only changed the way that identity was expressed outwardly. Accepting the limits of his body was the hardest part of this entire journey. After many years always pushing himself past pain, admitting that his body could no longer respond as before was a deep internal transition. But instead of fighting it, Essien gradually learned to live with it, understanding that those limits did not diminish the value of what he had achieved, but only marked the end of one chapter and opened another with a completely different rhythm. In the quiet of the new life, with no more cheers, no more playing pressure, no more weekly battles, Essien gradually found a different balance, where he no longer had to prove who he was on the pitch, but only needed to be present with what he had been through. And it was precisely in that acceptance that he did not collapse, did not fall apart, but step by step learned to live with what remained of himself. A version that no longer ran as fast as before, but still carried all the memories, experiences, and character of one of the strongest midfielders football had ever witnessed. When looking back at Michael Essien's entire journey, people do not only see a football career spanning many countries and many different peaks, but also see a story of silent sacrifice, where every achievement was traded for the limits of the body and the silences that very few people truly saw. From the early days in Ghana, where football was the only path to escape poverty, to becoming the irreplaceable heart of midfield at Chelsea FC, then continuing the journey through Real Madrid and AC Milan, Essien had gone through every level of top football, leaving his mark not only with titles, but with the way he played, the way he fought, and the way he never backed down. The titles he won were not just simple trophies, but proof of a period when he was almost the heart of every team he played for. Domestic championships, European titles, big matches where he always appeared in the most important moments, all created the image of a complete midfielder, a warrior who could change the course of a match simply with his presence. But behind those achievements was a price that could not be seen immediately, a price paid with hundreds of high-intensity matches, with recurring injuries, and with the gradual wear of a body once seen as almost unbreakable. The price paid was not only physical but also mental. The years of having to continuously return after injury, the times witnessing his position change in the lineup, the moments of having to learn to accept no longer being the center of everything, all created a journey full of contradictions between will and human limits. Essien was not someone who talked much about those things, and perhaps that was why his pain became deeper, because it was not expressed outwardly through words or controversies, but existed in the silence prolonged throughout his career. His image in fans' memory was not that of a noisy star, but a silent warrior who always appeared at the right time, always did the hardest jobs on the field, always put the team above himself without demanding equivalent recognition. He did not build his legacy with statements or media images, but with plays, runs, selfless dives, and that very thing made him one of the most respected players of his generation. When his career gradually reached its final phase, Essien was no longer the player of explosive moments, but became a symbol of endurance and acceptance. He did not try to cling to the halo, but accepted that football, like every other journey, had an ending. But what made his legacy special was not the number of titles or matches, but the way he went through that entire journey. Without complaining, without showing off, without demanding anything in return. In fans' hearts, Essien was not only a player who once competed at the peak, but the image of a person who had given everything he had to football, even when his body was no longer enough to continue. And as time passed, what remained was not the moments he won, but the way he fought throughout that journey, a journey of silent sacrifice, of limits pushed to the extreme, and of a spirit that never gave up even though his body had many times forced him to stop. Essien's legacy, therefore, did not lie in numbers, but in the memory of those who had once watched him play, in the image of a midfielder who never avoided responsibility, and in the story of a person who had given everything he had without ever demanding anything back. Looking back at Michael Essien's entire journey, from a boy growing up in poverty in Ghana, where football was not a romantic dream but a path of survival, to becoming the heart of midfield at Chelsea FC under Jose Mourinho, people cannot help but feel a profound sadness mixed with respect. His story was not only the journey of a player winning titles at Real Madrid or AC Milan, but the journey of a person who continuously traded his body to maintain his role in the world of top football. The recurring injuries, the returns to the pitch when his body had not fully recovered, and the gradual decline in physical condition not only reflected biological limits, but also the price of a spirit that never accepted stopping. Essien did not collapse in a noisy way. He had no scandals, no moments of self-destructive image, but this very silence and endurance made his story more painful, because it showed how much a person could sacrifice before being forced to accept his own limits. From the perspective of American audiences, where culture highly values individual success but is also increasingly recognizing the value of mental and physical health, Essien's story is a powerful reminder that not every dedication should be extended to the end. His continuous returns to play despite his body sending warning signals, and his gradual loss of position, not because of lack of talent but because of physical wear, show how thin the line between glory and injury can be. The lesson learned does not lie in always trying harder, but in knowing when to stop to protect oneself. Knowing that a person's value lies not only in the ability to endure, but also in the ability to listen to one's own limits. Essien gave everything to football, and precisely because of that, he deserves to be honored not only as a great player, but as a symbol of silent sacrifice, so that we understand that sometimes greatness does not lie in never falling, but in having stood up so many times even when the body no longer allowed it. If Michael Essien's story has touched you, please hit subscribe to continue accompanying us on the emotional journeys behind football legends. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore untold stories.